What if everything you thought you knew about predator and prey was turned upside down on the wildest night of your life? In the heart of the Coconino National Forest, as thunder shook the sky, Sawyer Brooks, wildlife biologist and lifelong loner, stumbled across a shivering bobcat kitten, abandoned and barely clinging to life. But he wasn't alone. Watching from the shadows, battered and limping, was a wolf who should have been their enemy, but became their only hope. This isn't just a story about survival. It's about breaking old rules, discovering wild mercy, and how one night changed a man, a town, and the way we all see the wild. If you believe in second chances and the power of compassion, give this video a like. And if you want to join us for more true stories where courage and connection change everything, hit subscribe and be part of our community. Stay with us. Because sometimes, the wildest hearts teach us the most about coming home. In the Coconino National Forest, just outside Flagstaff, dusk was falling hard. Clouds stacked up like bruised fists above the ponderosa pines, and the summer air tasted of electricity, rain, and something older. Fear, maybe, or hope. Sawyer Brooks trudged down the narrow backcountry trail, boots squelching in mud from a morning squall, notebook zipped in his jacket. The last GPS collar ping had come in half a mile back, and he was running late, again. At 42, Sawyer had spent more nights than he cared to remember chasing ghosts in the woods. Wolves, mostly. Shadows on the edge of extinction and legend. But tonight the forest felt sharper, stranger, as if the wild itself was watching. A hot metallic flash split the sky. Lightning, so close it made Sawyer's skin crawl. He ducked instinctively, heart pounding, and cursed softly as rain hammered down, needles of cold stinging his face. He fumbled for his headlamp and hustled toward the trailhead, the ponderosas creaking and swaying overhead. Somewhere to his left, thunder cracked, deep as a god's growl. He was almost to the parking lot when he heard it. A sound too thin, too desperate to belong to the wind. Mewling, high and pitiful, from a tangle of manzanita near the trail. Sawyer stopped. The smart move was to keep walking. Out here, you didn't meddle with lost things. Not with a storm rolling in and darkness closing fast. But something tugged at him. An old reflex, maybe. The part of him that still remembered what it felt like to be small, lost, and overlooked. He knelt, brushing aside wet leaves. There, half buried in the brush, was a kitten. No ordinary stray, but a bobcat, all oversized paws and stubby tail, fur slicked flat by rain. Its eyes were blue, wide and wild, rimmed with fear. It was shivering so hard its ribs fluttered, abandoned, barely alive. "Easy," Sawyer breathed, voice steady, hands trembling. He stripped off a glove, sliding it under the little body. The kitten didn't resist. It only pressed weakly into his palm, so light it hardly seemed real. Its breath rasped, shallow and broken. Another flash of lightning illuminated the woods, illuminated something else, too. Up on the trail, standing broadside and silent, was a wolf. Sawyer's blood turned to ice. Not a young wolf either. This one was huge, battered, its fur matted and scarred, a torn ear standing up like a warning flag. Its eyes burned yellow in the flash. It didn't snarl, didn't charge. It only watched, circling, slow and deliberate, staying between Sawyer and the open trail. Sawyer's every instinct screamed danger. He knew the statistics, knew attacks were rare, but instinct didn't care about facts in the dark, with adrenaline surging and thunder rolling. He drew in a shaky breath, glancing down at the kitten, then back at the wolf. The storm built to a frenzy, sheets of rain turning the world to gray static. For a wild heartbeat, the only reality was 3 points: man, cub, and wolf, balanced in a triangle of need and uncertainty. He tried to stand, cradling the kitten to his chest, but the wolf paced sideways, blocking the path. There was intelligence in those eyes, something more than hunger, something Sawyer couldn't name. The wolf's chest heaved with every breath. He could see the animal's exhaustion, the way it favored one leg. Old wounds, hard-won survival. "Not tonight," Sawyer muttered, his voice barely audible over the storm. "We're not your enemy, not tonight." The kitten whimpered. The wolf flicked an ear. Somewhere behind them, another crack of thunder sent a flock of jays screaming into the air. The moment stretched. Sawyer knew the woods, knew animal behavior, but nothing in his training covered this. A human, a wounded wolf, a dying bobcat, drawn together by storm and accident, fate, or something wilder. He risked a step sideways, eyes never leaving the wolf. The animal matched him, muscles tensed but didn't lunge. Sawyer's mind raced. Should he throw a rock? Shout? He remembered suddenly, being 8 years old in a foster home, hiding under a bed with a sick stray kitten, hoping no one would notice. The rain slowed briefly, enough for the world to snap into painful clarity. The wolf's fur bristled. It glanced once at the kitten in Sawyer's arms. Then it lowered its head, blocking the trailhead fully, hackles raised, not at Sawyer, but at something deeper in the forest. A warning, a new sound, shrill, hungry, echoed through the trees. Coyotes closing in. The wolf's lips peeled back in a silent snarl. Sawyer froze, breath shallow. The escape route was gone, the forest alive with unseen threats. He had no choice but to retreat, deeper into the wild, toward a rocky overhang he'd seen before, the wolf herding him without a word. Lightning danced along the horizon. Somewhere in the space between predator and prey, the old rules faded, replaced by something more primal, survival for all three. As they reached the shelter, Sawyer ducked beneath the stone lip, the kitten clutched to his chest, the wolf looming just outside, sentinel in shadow. For now, the storm had forced a truce. But what would happen when the thunder stopped? And outside, the wolf's eyes glowed in the darkness, waiting. Thunder shuddered through the Coconino night, echoing down the stone corridors of the forest. The storm didn't let up. Instead, it raged harder, flattening grasses and rattling the ancient ponderosa pines overhead. Sawyer crouched beneath the rocky overhang, his knees pressed to his chest, one hand clutching the cold stone, the other cradling the shivering form of the bobcat kitten. His breath steamed in the damp air, heart knocking against his ribs. Lightning split the sky again, illuminating the mouth of the overhang, illuminating the wolf. The great animal stood guard at the entrance, water streaming from its battered coat. Scar tissue glinted pale on its flanks. It turned its head, golden eyes meeting Sawyer's with a steady, unblinking stare. In that moment, the line between wild and human felt paper-thin, just the raw, electric presence of life, stubbornly enduring. The kitten whimpered, nuzzling into Sawyer's chest, claws kneading his rain-soaked jacket. He shifted, trying to shield the tiny creature from the cold. He could feel the animal's frail heartbeat, fast and fluttery. He ran through every bit of animal care knowledge he'd ever picked up. What did a bobcat kitten eat? How to treat shock? What about exposure? But the real question pressing in was simpler and more frightening. How long would the wolf allow this truce to last? Sawyer barely dared to breathe. The wolf watched him, but there was no snarl, no bristling hackles, just a quiet, eerie tension. The rain drove sideways, churning the forest into a blur, and somewhere beyond the trees, a chorus of yips and howls split the night. Coyotes. They moved like shadows, cunning and hungry, their calls rising and falling with the wind. The wolf's ears pricked, muscles tightening. Sawyer's thoughts raced. Coyotes, at least 3, maybe more, drawn by the kitten's scent and by the vulnerability it represented. Out here, the line between protector and predator was always shifting. He pressed the kitten closer, wishing he could vanish, wishing he'd taken another trail, wishing he didn't care. But he did care. So much it hurt. The coyotes closed in, their cries echoing off the rocks. The wolf took a step forward, blocking the entrance fully now, head low, lips peeling back in a silent snarl. Its tail lashed. A flash of lightning revealed the lean gray shapes slinking between the trees, eyes glinting like cold coins. Sawyer's pulse spiked. The wolf let out a low, guttural growl, a sound so deep, so primal it seemed to vibrate through the stone. One coyote darted closer, bold and reckless. In an instant, the wolf lunged, jaws snapping. The coyote yelped, tumbling backward into the brush. The others circled, wary but hungry. For the next hour, maybe 2, maybe a lifetime, the storm howled and the standoff continued. The wolf stood its ground, teeth bared, holding the coyotes at bay. Sawyer sat frozen, unable to help, unable to look away. Rain battered his face, dripped down his collar, pooled in his boots. He tried to think, tried to remember every lesson from his years in the field. Nothing prepared him for this, for being protected by a creature everyone else called a threat. The bobcat kitten whimpered again, mewling softly. Sawyer stroked its ears, murmuring nonsense, anything to soothe it. The wolf flicked an ear back, almost as if listening. Another flash, another rush from the coyotes, but the wolf met them with savage efficiency. It fought with a wounded fury, lunging, snapping, never giving ground. One coyote took a nip at the wolf's haunch, but was sent sprawling by a vicious swipe. The wolf limped, but didn't falter, breath coming hard and ragged. Blood, Sawyer couldn't tell if it was old or new, streaked the animal's leg. The storm raged on. Sawyer's mind wandered in circles, memories of childhood, of hiding in closets during arguments, of longing for someone, anyone, to stand between him and the world. He felt the same ache now, deep in his chest. He realized he was rooting for the wolf, this battered survivor risking everything for a kitten that wasn't its own. Time blurred, the cold bit deeper. At some point, the coyotes gave up, their howls retreating into the forest. The wolf stood panting at the entrance, shoulders quivering, fur matted and filthy. Sawyer didn't move. The truce held, strange and fragile as spider silk. The rain eased at last, thinning to a fine mist. The forest outside was eerily still, the only sound the wolf's ragged breathing and the soft, uncertain sigh of the kitten. Sawyer felt something shift inside him, a flicker of gratitude, of awe. He reached for his med kit, careful not to startle the wolf, checking the kitten for injuries. Miraculously, it was alive, but so too was the wolf, battered but unbowed. Minutes dragged by. The wolf didn't leave. Instead, it circled, finally settling at the mouth of the shelter, eyes half-lidded, but alert. Sawyer watched, mind racing with possibilities. Was the wolf drawn by the kitten? Or was it guarding them both, from coyotes, from the storm, maybe even from the loneliness that stalked all living things? He didn't have answers. Not yet. But as dawn's first silver hint crept along the horizon, Sawyer realized something had changed. Out in the wild, in the middle of danger, 3 souls, predator, prey, and human, had survived the storm together. The wolf lifted its head, gaze locked on the woods beyond. It wasn't going anywhere. Not yet. And Sawyer, holding the fragile bundle in his arms, realized neither was he. The storm finally faded into a memory, rain dwindling to a gentle patter that barely touched the thick canopy overhead. For the first time in hours, the air inside the overhang felt breathable, cool, damp, and tinged with pine needles, wet earth, and the faint tang of ozone. Sawyer blinked, muscles aching from hours hunched protectively over the kitten, every sense still strung tight like a wire. He checked his watch. Almost 3 a.m. The world outside was a charcoal wash of tree trunks and dripping moss, the night so deep it pressed against the little cave like a living thing. The bobcat kitten in his arms was no longer shivering violently, but it remained weak and dazed, eyes half closed, tufts of fur sticking out in awkward clumps. Sawyer set his flashlight to a dim beam, careful not to startle the wolf, and reached for his battered medkit. He worked quietly, hands trembling. "You're all right, little guy," he murmured, tearing open a packet of glucose gel meant for emergencies. He dabbed a bit on the kitten's lips. It mewed in confusion, then licked the sweetness, tiny tongue flickering. He checked for injuries. Miraculously, no broken bones. Just dehydration, hunger, and exhaustion. The wolf had not moved far. It was a living shadow at the mouth of the overhang, its body sprawled across the dirt. One paw stretched out protectively. Sawyer risked a glance. He could see the creature's chest rising and falling, could hear its labored, uneven breathing. The wolf's fur was plastered flat by rain, revealing old scars, a story written in flesh. Its head drooped, but its eyes remained open, bright and wary in the half-light. "What are you?" Sawyer wondered. "What have you survived out there?" He thought of all the wolves he'd tracked over the years, all the fear and misunderstanding they carried on their broad shoulders. None had looked at him like this one did, not with challenge or suspicion, but with something quieter, tiredness maybe, or a strange sort of patience. He gave the kitten a few drops of water from his bottle, then wrapped it in his dry undershirt, tucking it against his body for warmth. Whiskers, that's what he decided to call the kitten, because the long white whiskers twitched with every breath, made a tiny sound, and burrowed closer. Its fur was soft, softer than Sawyer expected, and its claws snagged in the fabric as it needed for comfort. His thoughts wandered, unmoored by exhaustion. He drifted back to his own childhood, the way memories tend to surface in the hush after chaos. He saw himself at 10, clutching a battered backpack in a foster home, listening for footsteps on the creaking stairs. He'd felt small then, invisible, desperate for someone to notice, to stand guard when the world turned mean. No one ever had. He'd learned to make himself quiet, self-sufficient, the sort of person who never needed anything from anyone. Now, looking down at Whiskers, Sawyer saw that same longing mirrored in the kitten's trembling body, the universal ache to be safe, to be protected, to belong to someone. He glanced up at the wolf. Even wild things, he realized, carried that ache inside them. The quiet deepened, broken only by the slow drip of water from the stone ceiling. Sawyer studied the wolf, eyes drawn to the fresh cuts on its flank and the deep tear in its left ear. He wanted to help. Years of fieldwork had drilled first aid into his bones, but he didn't dare move any closer. The wolf watched him with a look that was neither threat nor plea, simply a weary acceptance. Whiskers shifted, little paws scrabbling against Sawyer's chest. Then, to his surprise, the kitten wriggled free of the undershirt and tottered toward the wolf. "Hey!" Sawyer whispered, but Whiskers paid no mind. Lured by some instinct older than fear, the kitten approached the massive animal, tail quivering, and pressed itself into the thick fur of the wolf's belly. Sawyer held his breath. The wolf twitched, just once, but did not move away. Instead, it curled its body minutely, sheltering the kitten with its warmth. Whiskers purred, a fragile vibration lost beneath the wolf's heavy breathing. For a moment, time itself seemed to pause. Sawyer watched, transfixed, as predator and prey huddled together. No rules, no expectations, just a moment of shelter in the wild. It struck him how little it took to upend everything he thought he knew about nature's laws. Compassion, even here, survived alongside hunger and violence. Maybe, he thought, the need to connect was older than the need to hunt. He wrapped his arms around his knees, listening to the duet of breaths, the slow steadying of the kitten's pulse, the wolf's rumbling exhale. He felt oddly exposed, as if these two animals had stripped away his last defenses. For so long, he'd armored himself with knowledge, with solitude, with the idea that he could always survive alone. But out here in the dark, he saw how fragile that armor truly was. Sawyer's eyelids grew heavy. He fought sleep, afraid to let his guard down, afraid to dream. He forced himself to jot a few notes in his field journal. Wolf not aggressive, seems protective of kitten. Both exhausted. Will try to get help at first light. But the words felt thin compared to the enormity of what he was witnessing. He gazed at the wolf, whose eyes were finally closing, body relaxing fraction by fraction. Whiskers was almost invisible against the wolf's fur, curled into a perfect comma. Sawyer pulled his jacket tighter, feeling both small and part of something much larger. He whispered, not sure if he meant it for the animals or himself. We all just want someone to stand watch for us, don't we? The forest answered only with silence. Dawn was still hours away, but hope, wild and unexpected, had already begun to rise. The hush after the storm was total. No more thunder, no screaming wind, not even a coyote's yip on the horizon. Only the faint, regular drip of rain from pine needles and the low rumble of distant water, flowing somewhere out of sight. Sawyer Brooks barely dared to move as a strange peace crept into the little overhang. The forest, washed by hours of relentless rain, now shone with a wet golden glow as dawn spread slow and careful fingers through the trees. Sawyer felt every ache in his body, every bruise from rocks and roots. But he didn't care. He didn't want to break the spell. For the first time all night, he realized his hands weren't shaking. The kitten, Whiskers, still slept, pressed into the fur at the wolf's chest, rising and falling with the animal's steady breath. The wolf had finally surrendered to exhaustion, snout resting atop one massive paw, battered body curled around the little bobcat like a living shield. Sawyer blinked, overcome by a mix of relief and confusion. The sight before him made no sense, yet it was realer than anything he'd ever experienced in the wild. It was as if the storm had scoured away all the usual boundaries, leaving only what mattered most: survival, connection, mercy. He slowly sat up, wincing as his stiff knees protested. He needed to think. He needed to do something. But what? If he tried to pick up the kitten now, would the wolf let him? Or would all that hard-earned trust vanish with the first move? He stared at his hands, still dirty, still trembling faintly with adrenaline's echo. He remembered, vividly, like a movie playing behind his eyes, the years he'd spent telling himself that wild things stayed wild, that it was better, safer to keep your distance, to watch, to measure, to catalog, but never to risk real closeness. Even as a kid, shuffled between homes, he'd learned to expect little from others. You only got hurt if you let yourself believe you belonged. And yet, here he was, feeling that old ache again, the longing to believe in something gentler, braver, more hopeful than mere survival. Whiskers mewed in its sleep, a tiny sound. The wolf's ear twitched, but it did not wake. Sawyer exhaled, the breath fogging in the chill. He looked out at the woods. Mist curled through the trees, blurring the line between shadow and sunlight. Somewhere high up, a Steller's jay screeched, announcing the new day. Every leaf, every stone gleamed. The world, after chaos, was reborn. The wolf shifted at last, stirring as a shaft of sun touched its face. It raised its head, eyes bleary, then fixed on Sawyer. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Man and beast, predator and observer, each trying to understand the other's next move. The wolf sniffed the air, then nuzzled the kitten, licking its head with rough tenderness. Sawyer felt a surge of awe and a strange kinship. The wolf's scars, jagged lines across its muzzle, a ragged ear, were badges of hard-won survival. Its limp, the way it protected Whiskers, all spoke of battles fought and lost and endured. He knew those battles in his own way. Loss, loneliness, the instinct to withdraw instead of risk pain. The wolf slowly rose, testing its weight on the injured leg, favoring it as it limped to the mouth of the overhang. For a heartbeat, it looked back, at Whiskers, at Sawyer. Its eyes lingered. Then, without a sound, the wolf disappeared into the glowing forest, swallowed by sunlight and mist. There was no drama, no backward glance, just a living being returning to the wild it could never fully leave behind. Sawyer felt a jolt of panic, an absurd, childish fear that he'd been abandoned again. But Whiskers shifted, blinking awake, and pressed itself deeper into his lap. Sawyer gathered the kitten into his jacket, heart pounding. It seemed so small, so breakable, yet so stubbornly alive. He stood, legs shaky, and took a step out from the overhang. Sunlight hit his face, warm and brilliant. The forest was quiet, holding its breath. He could almost hear his own thoughts. The doubts, the questions, the memories, echoing in the golden hush. Was he doing the right thing? Was it mercy to take the kitten from this place, or was it just another human mistake taming what was meant to stay wild? Sawyer shook his head, trying to clear the fog of uncertainty. He knelt by a puddle, letting Whiskers drink. The kitten's rough tongue lapped at the water, eyes half closed in pleasure. For a moment, Sawyer watched the reflection, his own haggard face beside the kitten's, both framed by the trembling leaves above. "I'll take care of you," he whispered. "I promise, whatever happens." It was a vow deeper than words, a silent pact, shaped by everything he'd learned, and everything he still didn't know. He would be the guardian he'd always wished for, even if just for this little scrap of wildness. He'd stand between Whiskers and the worst of the world, for as long as he could. He tucked the kitten into his jacket and set off down the trail, moving slowly, feeling the weight of the night, the memory of the wolf's watchful eyes, the taste of hope. As he walked, the forest opened around him, light filtering through in golden shafts, the world fresh and alive. With every step, Sawyer's doubts faded, replaced by a quiet determination. He knew the challenges would come: feeding, shelter, the legal mess of keeping a wild animal. He knew the wolf might be out there still, watching from the shadows, but for now, the forest felt like a place of second chances. He looked down at Whiskers, who gazed back with wide, trusting eyes. Sawyer smiled, feeling the old ache begin to heal just a little. Maybe, he thought, mercy was the bravest thing of all. And as the sun climbed, banishing the last of the storm, Sawyer carried his new promise home. The drive back to Flagstaff was a blur. The highway unfurled in a silver ribbon beneath morning sun, trees streaming past, mountains looming blue in the distance. Sawyer barely registered the miles. His mind was caught in a loop of last night's storm, the wolf's eyes, and the fragile life bundled against his chest. The truck's heater cranked full blast, fogging the windshield. Whiskers stirred in his makeshift nest, a nest built from a fleece hoodie and Sawyer's own undershirt, both of which still smelled of pine, sweat, and rain. His small cabin, nestled at the edge of town, had never felt more like a sanctuary. The world outside might still be wild and unpredictable, but inside, Sawyer could control what he could. Warmth, shelter, food. He set Whiskers down gently on a folded towel atop the kitchen table, every movement careful, reverent. The kitten's eyes darted around, tiny body tensed, but exhaustion won out, and it slumped sideways with a sigh. Sawyer's first challenge was food. He rummaged through his fridge, leftover chicken, eggs, a few cans of tuna. Nothing felt quite right. He dialed up a local vet he trusted, masking his own anxiety with brisk professionalism. Found a stray, Bobcat Kitten. Looks about 3 weeks old, weak, cold. What do I do? The vet's advice was quick and matter-of-fact. Warmth first, hydration, then offer bits of soft, bland protein. Sawyer boiled chicken breast, shredded it with shaking hands, and mashed a few pieces with water into a paste. Whiskers sniffed it, unsure, then lapped it up with surprising energy. For the first time, Sawyer allowed himself a cautious hope. That afternoon, he rigged up an enclosure from an old dog crate and several towels, setting it in a corner of the living room by the wide front window. He set his field jacket nearby, the one the kitten had burrowed into during the storm, hoping the familiar scent would help Whiskers settle. He added a shallow water bowl, a box of soft dirt, a stuffed rabbit from a forgotten box of childhood things. The effect was more nursery than wilderness, but it was the best he could do. Sawyer sat nearby, pretending to read, but really just watching. Whiskers slept most of the day, twitching and dreaming, sometimes letting out a high-pitched mew. When awake, the kitten prowled the edges of the crate, blue eyes alert, ears swiveling at every new sound. A passing truck, a distant dog's bark, the thrum of rain against the roof. Once Whiskers pressed both paws to the glass, gazing out at the forest, as if searching for something just beyond the trees. That evening, as golden light stretched through the window, there was a sharp knock at the door. Sawyer stiffened, heartbeat spiking. Only a handful of people ever visited him, and even fewer unannounced. Becca Riley, the town's wildlife officer, stood on his porch, hands on her hips, expression a mix of concern and skepticism. "You know it's illegal to keep wild animals without a permit, right?" she said, pushing past him into the kitchen. Sawyer bristled, but gestured toward the crate. "He wouldn't have survived the night. I'll figure out the paperwork." Becca crouched, studying Whiskers through the bars. "You sure it's not a feral house cat?" Sawyer shook his head. "Tail's too short, ears are tufted. Markings. And he's got attitude, trust me." She watched the kitten a moment longer, then stood. "You're not planning to keep him, are you?" Sawyer hesitated. "I don't know. Maybe just until he's strong enough. Then I'll call wildlife rescue or something." Becca sighed. "Just don't get attached. And keep him away from people, pets, all that. If anyone calls it in, I can't protect you from state law." She gave him a look, softer now. "But I get it. If anyone can help him, it's you." She left him with a stack of forms, a stern warning, and a reluctant smile. As night crept in, Sawyer felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. Every few hours, he checked on Whiskers, coaxing him to drink, cleaning up the messes, jotting careful notes about his behavior. He snapped photos, sent a few to the vet and to Becca. No captions, just proof of progress. The kitten's eyes grew brighter by the hour, but there was always a restlessness, especially at dusk. Whiskers would press his nose to the glass, staring out into the deepening shadows, tail lashing. Some nights he'd let out a plaintive, keening cry that made the hairs on Sawyer's arms stand up. It was not a sound of pain, but of longing, calling out, perhaps, for the wild, or for something Sawyer couldn't understand. 1 week into this new routine, Sawyer installed a trail cam on a pine at the edge of his yard. It was more habit than hope. He'd used cameras to track wolves for years, studying their movements, gathering data. Maybe it was superstition, maybe just curiosity, but some instinct told him the story wasn't over. The next morning, he flipped through the camera's memory card over coffee, mind foggy with sleep. The usual suspects: raccoons, a skittish deer, a neighborhood cat. Then, in the pre-dawn hours, a shape emerged. Broad, powerful, unmistakable. The wolf. Its limp was more pronounced, ribs visible beneath a matted coat. The wolf stood in the blue shadow near Sawyer's cabin, eyes glowing, head lowered as if scenting the air. It lingered, silent and watchful, before vanishing into the trees. Sawyer stared at the image, heart pounding. Was it watching over Whiskers, or something else? He didn't know. He only knew that the wild, untamed and mysterious, had followed them home, a bond stretched between worlds. That night, as he tucked Whiskers in and double-checked the door, Sawyer felt the strange comfort of knowing he was not alone. The wolf was out there somewhere, and as the kitten mewed at the window, both man and animal listened for the echoes of wild mercy. Sawyer woke to trouble. The phone rang at dawn, jolting him from a shallow sleep. On the other end, Becca's voice was clipped, tight. "You need to hear this. There's been a string of livestock killings west of town. Cattle, goats, even a couple of backyard chickens. Folks are riled up. They're blaming a wolf. I know you've got trail cams up. Call me if you see anything." Sawyer hung up, unease growing in his gut. For a week, he'd watched Whiskers grow stronger. The kitten prowled his enclosure with increasing confidence, devouring meals, pouncing on the stuffed rabbit, and, at dusk, returning to the window, eyes searching the deepening woods. Every evening, the longing in Whiskers' mews seemed to grow sharper, more urgent. But now, the outside world was pressing in. News of the livestock attacks spread fast through the tight-knit community, fanning old fears. Sawyer drove into town for supplies and caught snippets of conversation at the feed store and coffee shop. Angry talk about the killer wolf, ranchers forming patrols, talk of traps and rifles. Old stories resurfaced, stories of wolves as monsters, threats, never as guardians. That night, after securing Whiskers for the evening, Sawyer stepped onto his porch with a flashlight. The woods beyond his yard were pitch black, filled with the scent of wet soil and distant wood smoke. He checked his trail cam. Nothing but shadows and wind. But he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as if some presence lingered just beyond the edge of the light. Sleep came reluctantly. Around midnight, thunder rolled again over the mountains, a low warning from the sky. Sawyer stirred, half dreaming, the hairs on his arms rising. He sat up, the house unnaturally silent. It took him a moment to notice. The faint creak of the window, the brush of fur against glass. He sprang from bed and raced to the living room. The enclosure door was open, just enough for a determined animal to squeeze through. The window was cracked, a gap barely wide enough for a bobcat kitten. Whiskers was gone. Panic surged through Sawyer, wild and cold. He grabbed boots, jacket, and flashlight, flung open the front door. The rain was coming down hard, pounding the porch in sheets, lightning flickering deep among the pines. He knelt by the window, shining his light along the muddy sill. Paw prints, small, round, and sure, led out into the yard. Alongside them, fainter but larger, were tracks unmistakably canine, the deep impressions of a wolf's limp. Sawyer's heart hammered. He had to act fast. He ducked inside for his field bag, first aid kit, rain poncho, bear spray, extra batteries. He left a hurried note for Becca, then plunged into the storm, following the twin trails that vanished into the trees. Branches whipped his face as he pushed through the undergrowth, mud sucking at his boots. Lightning flashed, illuminating the ghostly shapes of aspens and ponderosas. He called for Whiskers, voice lost in the roar of the rain. Every so often, he found another print, sometimes two, cat and wolf, side by side, heading deeper into the wild. As he climbed a rocky ridge, the air suddenly echoed with a sharp crack, gunshots, muffled by distance but unmistakable. Sawyer froze, dread churning in his gut. The ranchers. He remembered Becca's warning. Some of these guys mean business. Don't get in the way. But what choice did he have? Both Whiskers and the wolf were out there, in the crosshairs of fear and anger. He pressed on, feet slipping on wet stone, lungs burning. The woods grew thicker, the path vanishing beneath tangled brush and debris. He thought of the night in the overhang, the storm, the wolf's battered frame, the kitten pressed against its fur. If the wolf had returned for Whiskers, was it out of hunger or something more complicated? Sawyer's mind raced through every possibility. A bond, a pack instinct, simple mercy. He followed the trail for what felt like hours, the storm lashing him with rain and wind. At the edge of a clearing, he paused, senses straining. A faint, high-pitched cry, Whiskers somewhere ahead. Another flash of lightning showed a tangled mess of undergrowth, and, at its edge, a glint of metal, a snare. Sawyer's blood ran cold. He crashed forward, not caring about the noise. The cry came again, desperate. He saw movement, a small, sodden shape, Whiskers caught near the snare, paw snagged on the wire. The wolf was there too, circling the trap, growling low, ears flat against its head. In the distance, angry voices rose, shouting orders, the crunch of boots on wet gravel drawing closer. Sawyer's mind went blank except for one urgent command. "Move!" He fumbled for the bear spray, keeping it ready. He shouted, waving his arms. "Hey! Over here! Stay back!" The wolf turned to him, then back to Whiskers, torn between fight and flight. He rushed to the snare, heart thundering, fingers shaking as he worked the release. The wire cut his hand but came loose. Whiskers tumbled into his arms, trembling, fur matted and filthy, but alive. The wolf snarled at the approaching voices, then looked at Sawyer with something fierce and haunted in its eyes. Gunshots rang out again, closer this time. Sawyer scooped Whiskers to his chest and sprayed a cloud of bear spray into the air, stinging his own eyes, coughing as he backed away. The wolf, catching the scent, bolted into the darkness. Sawyer scrambled after, half blind, clutching the kitten as the voices of the ranchers faded behind him, lost in the storm. When he finally stumbled back into his yard, soaked to the bone, Whiskers clung to him, shivering. He collapsed onto the porch, breath coming in ragged gasps. The storm raged on, but the house was safe. Warm light spilling from the window. He cradled Whiskers, murmuring reassurances he barely believed himself. Outside, somewhere in the wild, the wolf's howl echoed, a sound of pain, defiance, and something like hope. And inside, Sawyer knew the truce was not over. Danger would return again. But for now, all three survivors, man, kitten, and wolf, had lived through another night. The storm pressed down, thick and relentless, turning the forest to a labyrinth of mist, wet leaves, and broken shadows. Sawyer's legs ached as he stumbled through tangled underbrush, vision blurred by rain and bear spray. His lungs burned. Every breath tasted of fear and earth. Whiskers huddled inside his jacket, small body pressed tight to his chest, claws pricking his skin with every jolt. Behind him, gunshots still rang out. Sporadic now, distant, but each one sent his heart racing. He pressed onward, drawn by a desperate instinct to get farther from the ranchers' angry voices. The forest at night was a place of secrets, but tonight it felt especially haunted. Every snapped branch and distant howl a reminder of how fragile life was, and how easily the wild could turn hostile. Still, even in his terror, Sawyer was alert for any sign of the wolf. Lightning illuminated the ridge ahead, outlining a familiar form in the gloom. The wolf, huge, battered, limping, moved in and out of the trees, head lowered, eyes reflecting every flash. It paused, seeming to scent the air, then disappeared again into the shadows. Sawyer hesitated, torn. Should he follow? His mind flashed back to the night under the overhang, to the way the wolf had shielded the kitten, to the strange understanding that had passed between man and beast. Behind him, a shout cut through the wind, closer than before. Sawyer turned and ducked behind a fallen log, holding his breath as two men crashed through the brush, rifles at the ready. Their voices were angry, tinged with fear. "Swear I saw something move right up there. That wolf's gonna pay for what it did. I'll be damned if another calf goes missing." Sawyer's heart hammered. He waited until the men passed, then crept the opposite direction, deeper into the forest. His boots slid in the mud, the wind tugged at his hood, and Whiskers whimpered, but he pressed on, guided by flashes of wolf tracks in the soft ground. It wasn't long before he found himself at the edge of a small clearing, the world beyond drenched in blue shadow. Lightning split the sky again, revealing a scene that nearly made him gasp. Whiskers' tracks ended at a patch of mud beside a crude wire snare. One of dozens ranchers had strung along the game trails. A few feet away, the wolf circled anxiously, snapping at the air, its attention fixed on something caught in the wire. Sawyer's stomach dropped. There, nearly invisible in the muck, was Whiskers, paw tangled in the snare, fur slicked with mud, eyes wide with terror. The kitten cried out, voice hoarse and thin. The wolf lunged, teeth flashing, but the wire held. For a moment, time slowed. Predator, prey, and protector, all locked together by fate and fear. Sawyer burst into the clearing, arms up. "Get back!" he shouted, voice cracking with desperation. The wolf spun, snarling, then stopped, recognition flickering in its gaze. For a split second, the three of them stood frozen, the wild, the lost, and the unlikely guardian. Behind them, the shouting voices drew nearer, flashlights bobbing through the trees. Sawyer dropped to his knees beside the snare, fumbling in the mud. His hands shook as he worked the knot, all too aware that a mistake could mean disaster for all three. The wolf growled low, pacing between him and the voices, hackles raised, tail lashing. "Easy, boy," Sawyer whispered, glancing up. "We're in this together, aren't we?" He freed the kitten at last, clutching the trembling bundle to his chest. He turned, waving the bear spray in the direction of the voices, not caring if he looked mad. "Back off!" he shouted again. The words whipped away by the wind. A shot rang out, striking a tree trunk just feet away. The wolf let out a furious snarl, lunging at the sound, then darted away, disappearing into the undergrowth. Sawyer didn't hesitate. He bolted after it, Whiskers held tight, the forest swallowing them in darkness. He ran until his legs nearly gave out, until the shouts and gunshots faded into the distance. The storm lessened, replaced by a deep, aching silence. Sawyer collapsed against a mossy boulder, heart pounding, chest heaving. Whiskers clung to him, shivering, eyes wide. The wolf reappeared in the gloom, circling warily, then settling a few feet away, battered and panting. Sawyer felt the enormity of the moment settle around him. Here, in the middle of the wilderness, after everything, the three of them were together again. Not as enemies, not as strangers, but as survivors, connected by what they'd risked for each other. He reached into his pack. Pulling out the last strip of jerky, he tossed it toward the wolf, who sniffed it, then devoured it with hungry, grateful jaws. Sawyer smiled, exhausted, feeling something break loose inside him, a wild hope, fierce and bright. For a long time they rested there, predator and prey and man, listening to the rain fade away. Sawyer's mind churned. Had he failed them both? Or had he done the only thing he could? The weight of responsibility pressed down, heavier than ever. Eventually, the wolf rose, limp more pronounced, and vanished into the trees. Sawyer picked himself up, clutching Whiskers, and made his way back home, guided by the faintest hint of dawn on the horizon. That night, after Whiskers was safe in his crate, Sawyer stood at the window, watching the tree line. He grieved, not just for the danger that wouldn't go away, but for the wild bonds that could never be fully understood, only honored. The forest was silent, but in that silence he heard the echo of a promise, to protect what he could, to fight for mercy in a world that so often chose fear. A dry, baking wind blew in from the south the next afternoon, replacing the storm's chill with a fierce, unsettling heat. The forest floor crackled underfoot, leaves curling, the air itself tasting of smoke and anxiety. In town, the sirens began at dusk. Wildfires had flared up on the mountain, whipped by wind and fueled by the season's drought. People packed bags, filled trucks with animals, and called loved ones to check in. Sawyer stood on his porch, eyes fixed on the orange glow spreading across the horizon, heart thudding with dread. He was on the phone with Becca when the call came. "We need help at the wildlife shelter," she said, breathless. "Evac teams are stretched thin. If you can get up here, bring your gear. Every pair of hands counts." Sawyer hung up, stuffing Whiskers' carrier with a blanket and food. He hesitated. Should he leave the kitten behind? No, not after all they'd survived. He slung his pack over his shoulder and bolted out the door, Whiskers mewling as the truck rumbled down the drive and out toward the evacuation zone. The shelter, at the forest's edge, was chaos. Dogs howled, volunteers loaded crates into pickups, and the sky burned a poisonous red. Becca greeted him with a tired wave. "We're prioritizing the birds and the ones who can't run," she said, shoving a list into his hands. "If you see anything wounded out there, anything you can't catch, just call it in. Don't play hero." Sawyer nodded, tucking Whiskers' crate in a quiet corner with the other evacuees. The kitten's eyes, wide and uncertain, followed every movement. Sawyer knelt beside the carrier, speaking softly. "I'll be back, I promise." He grabbed his field pack, first aid supplies, gloves, headlamp, water, and headed for the trail behind the shelter, a shortcut into the heart of the threatened woods. The smoke stung his eyes, visibility dropping with every step. Overhead, helicopters thudded, dumping water on the flames. Halfway up the ridge, Sawyer heard a sound, a ragged animal cry, sharp with pain. He pushed through the brush, heart pounding, searching for the source. A dark shape limped through the smoke ahead, barely visible. Sawyer froze. The wolf, it was a wreck, fur singed and patchy, one leg dragging, sides heaving with every labored breath. But it wasn't alone. Beside it, limping on a bloody paw, was Whiskers. The kitten must have escaped the shelter in the confusion, drawn by instinct or memory, seeking the wild companion who'd protected him in the storm. For a split second, Sawyer stood paralyzed by awe and terror. The fire crackled behind them, the smoke thickening, the orange glow painting everything in a hellish light. The wolf looked back, teeth bared, then nudged Whiskers forward, urging the kitten away from the flames. It wasn't running for itself. It was guiding the smaller animal, even as its own strength faltered. Sawyer dashed forward, crouching low. "Whiskers, over here!" The kitten hesitated, then limped toward his voice, collapsing in his arms. Sawyer glanced at the wolf. Its sides were streaked with soot, an old wound reopened and bleeding. The animal swayed on its feet, but stood its ground, gaze defiant. Shouts echoed through the smoke. Other volunteers, maybe, or frightened ranchers. Sawyer didn't have time to think. He looped an arm around Whiskers and called softly to the wolf. "Come on, big guy. Don't give up now." He fished a strip of jerky from his pocket and tossed it. The wolf sniffed it, eyes flickering with uncertainty, then stumbled forward, following as Sawyer and Whiskers pushed toward safety. They moved in fits and starts, dodging burning branches and choking on ash. Once a tree crashed down behind them, the heat so fierce Sawyer's skin prickled. He poured water over Whiskers and splashed some on the wolf's side, trying to keep both animals cool enough to make it another 100 yards. By the time they reached the shelter, his shirt was soaked with sweat, eyes stinging. Becca met them at the door, mouth dropping open in disbelief. "Is that—" she started, but Sawyer cut her off. "Burn kit. Now. This wolf saved Whiskers. Let's get to work." The next few hours blurred into a frantic dance of triage. Volunteers rushed back and forth, carrying injured owls, rabbits, dogs. Sawyer and Becca worked side by side, cleaning Whiskers' wounds and wrapping the wolf's burned leg. The big animal bore it all in grim silence, jaws clenched, breath wheezing. When they were done, the wolf slumped into a crate, eyes closing, finally surrendering to exhaustion. News of the rescue spread quickly, first among the shelter staff, then through town, then to the wider world. Someone snapped a photo of Sawyer kneeling between the battered wolf and the soot-streaked kitten, hands gentle, eyes weary. Within hours, the image was everywhere. Online, on the local news, even picked up by a national outlet. Wildfire miracle. Wolf risks life to save Bobcat Kitten. The mood in town shifted. Where there had been talk of killer wolves and danger, now there was awe, even pride. Ranchers and townsfolk donated supplies to the shelter. Kids made cards and drawings. Strangers came by, peering through the shelter window, hoping for a glimpse of the wild pair. But as night fell and the last of the flames died out, Sawyer sat by the animals' crates, haunted by questions. Would the wolf heal enough to return to the wild? Would Whiskers survive on his own? Or was he now too changed by the kindness of man and wolf alike? He stroked Whiskers' head, then rested a gentle hand on the wolf's battered shoulder. "You did good," he murmured. "Whatever happens next, you did good." Outside, the smoke cleared. Stars glimmered above, and the world waited. Changed, uncertain, but filled with new possibility. The fire left scars, blackened stumps, ash drifts along the ridge, patches of bare earth where the green would someday return. The Coconino National Forest had always been a place of survival and second chances. But now, in the quiet days after the crisis, everything felt sharper, more fragile, more precious. The story of the wolf and the bobcat kitten spread across the state and beyond, reshaping how people looked at the wild and at themselves. At the wildlife shelter, recovery was slow. Whiskers, bandaged but restless, prowled the corners of his enclosure, mewing for Sawyer, or pressing his nose against the glass for hours at a time. The wolf, now named Blaze by the shelter staff, slept for days, drifting in and out of consciousness as his wounds healed, muscles twitching as if he dreamed of running again through the high country. Sawyer came every day. He brought notes, sketches, and when allowed, treats, a strip of beef for Blaze, a feather toy for Whiskers. He took to sitting on the floor outside the animals' enclosures, journal open in his lap, recording not just scientific observations but feelings, questions, memories that rose like smoke after rain. At first, he felt awkward, exposed. He wrote about the storm, the fear, the odd moments of connection that seemed to change everything. He confessed his own loneliness, the years spent observing wild things, but rarely letting anyone see his own wild heart. He filled pages with what he'd learned, that mercy was not a weakness, that it was part of the wild's oldest survival code. The shelter became a gathering place. Reporters called for interviews. School kids arrived by the busload, clutching notebooks and drawings. Volunteers started new programs inspired by the story, pairing traumatized animals, sometimes across species, so they could comfort each other. People who'd once feared wolves or scorned bobcats now saw them as survivors, teachers, even neighbors. Sawyer watched this shift with wonder. He found himself telling the story over and over, first to the curious, then to skeptics, then to anyone who would listen. "What I saw," he'd say, voice trembling only a little, "wasn't about who eats whom or what the books say. It was about recognizing need, about stepping in, not turning away." Becca, who'd once warned him not to get attached, became an ally. She organized a community meeting at the shelter, inviting everyone, ranchers, hikers, teachers, even the local sheriff. At first, the room buzzed with nervous energy, but when Becca projected the now famous photo of Blaze and Whiskers, side by side, battered but alive, the mood changed. People asked questions, shared stories, debated what coexistence could mean. One rancher stood up, voice gruff but honest. "I've lost livestock to predators. I get angry, scared. But seeing that wolf fight to save a kitten makes me wonder if we've been looking at it all wrong." A teacher chimed in. "My students talk about nothing else. They want to know how mercy fits into the food chain. I think we all do." Sawyer listened, surprised by the hope stirring in the room. He realized that, just as Blaze had risked everything to protect Whiskers, he too could risk a little, opening his own story to others, letting old wounds breathe in the sunlight. He visited Blaze and Whiskers every morning, even on days when exhaustion or doubt made it hard to leave his bed. He noticed that, as the animals healed, they found comfort in each other's presence. Even separated by wire and glass, their gazes would meet and linger. When a volunteer left the kitten's enclosure door open one day, Whiskers padded over to the wolf's crate and curled up nearby, content simply to be close. For Sawyer, it was a lesson he couldn't ignore. He wrote about it, talked about it, even dreamed about it. That instinct to connect, across difference, across pain, even across species, wasn't just rare, it was necessary. Maybe the wild had always known something that humans, in their hurry, often forgot. That the greatest strength wasn't in power or dominance, but in compassion, in the willingness to protect and to trust. The shelter responded to the attention by launching new educational initiatives. Coexistence Days became a monthly event. Wildlife officials re-examined predator management, introducing programs that emphasized understanding and empathy instead of just control. Kids left the shelter with more than just photos. They left with questions, ideas, the seed of something larger growing inside them. Sawyer saw the change in himself too. The wall he'd built over a lifetime, meant to keep him safe, began to crack. He let himself talk about his childhood in foster care, about the ache to be guarded by someone, anyone, during his darkest nights. He realized, in helping Whiskers and Blaze, he was healing a part of himself he'd long neglected. One morning, as he packed up his journal to leave, a little girl stopped him at the gate. She clutched a crayon drawing of a wolf and a bobcat, both smiling. "My mom says wolves are scary," she whispered, "but I think they can be heroes. Is that true?" Sawyer knelt beside her, voice gentle. "I think anyone, wolf, bobcat, or human, can be a hero. Sometimes it just means being brave enough to care." That night, in the quiet of his cabin, Sawyer read back over his journal. He saw in his own words a journey from isolation to connection, from fear to mercy. He understood, finally, that what happened in the wild wasn't just a story about animals. It was a story about all of them, about the courage to break old patterns, to answer a cry for help, to see one another with new eyes. Mercy, he realized, was the oldest survival instinct of all. And as dawn crept over the Coconino, Sawyer knew the story had already changed the world, and himself, forever. The weeks after the fire passed like a gentle turning of the seasons. Summer faded to golden autumn, and the Coconino National Forest slowly recovered from its scars. Where the fire had left the land blackened and barren, the first green shoots pushed up through the ash. Proof that life, stubborn and wild, would always find its way back. It was the kind of lesson Sawyer Brooks felt deep in his bones. Survival wasn't just about endurance, but about transformation. At the wildlife shelter, Whiskers grew strong. Each day, the Bobcat Kitten's legs grew steadier, his coat glossier, his eyes sharper. The staff marveled at his recovery. Children visiting the shelter pressed their hands to the glass, hoping for a glimpse of the little survivor. Whiskers, for his part, never lost the wildness in his gaze. Though he'd grown used to gentle hands and soft voices, each dusk he'd pace restlessly, ears pricked toward the distant pines. Blaze, the wolf, healed more slowly. His limp would never fully disappear, and the burns along his haunch left a permanent silver streak in his fur. But in the shelter, he was no longer the battered outcast lurking on the edge of the wild. Instead, he became a symbol, a living legend who'd risked everything for a helpless kitten, turning centuries of fear and prejudice on their head. People left notes and flowers at his enclosure. Ranchers who'd once called for traps sent money for his care. Even Becca, hardened by years of dealing with loss, teared up sometimes, watching Blaze rest in the late sun, eyes half closed but finally at peace. Sawyer visited often. He sat with Whiskers, watched the kitten stretch and climb, sometimes reading aloud from field journals just for the sound of a voice. With Blaze, he kept a respectful distance at first, kneeling just outside the fence, talking in low tones about nothing and everything. Sometimes, in quiet moments, the wolf would approach, pressing his nose to the chain-link, golden eyes meeting Sawyer's. In those wordless exchanges, there was an understanding, one that needed no language. The months drifted on. The story of the wolf and the wild kitten became more than just local lore. Reporters came from out of state. Conservation groups wrote articles about the night guard story. School kids across Arizona raised money for the shelter. The governor even sent a letter of recognition, a testament to the power of compassion in the wild and in ourselves. But for Sawyer, the most profound changes happened not on the news, but within himself. He found his world opening up. He reconnected with old friends, people he'd pushed away in the name of solitude. He called his estranged sister, awkward at first, then easier, finding laughter they hadn't shared since childhood. He started volunteering at the shelter, not just with Whiskers and Blaze, but helping other animals, teaching kids about the forest, about survival, about the courage it takes to choose mercy. One bright Saturday, Becca found him at the edge of the release meadow, Whiskers in a carrier at his feet. The kitten was healthy, powerful, grown now into a small but fierce adolescent bobcat. "It's time," she said quietly, voice warm and sad all at once. Sawyer nodded, heart heavy and hopeful. Together they carried Whiskers to a remote, protected stretch of forest, a place safe from hunters, far from roads. The kitten's ears twitched as he sniffed the air, tail flicking. Sawyer knelt, opening the carrier door. "Go on," he whispered. "You're ready." For a moment, Whiskers hesitated, glancing back with those wild, unblinking eyes. Then, with a flick of his tail, he bounded into the undergrowth, disappearing almost instantly among the ferns and shadows. Sawyer blinked hard, feeling pride and loss mingle in his chest. Freedom was the point, he reminded himself. The goal was never to possess, but to let go. Back at the shelter, Blaze watched the woods from his pen, nose lifted to the wind. The wolf was too old, too injured to join a pack again, but in the twilight hours, he'd sometimes slip to the fence line, watching the tree line as if waiting for a sign. Some mornings, fresh bobcat tracks appeared in the soft earth nearby. 2 sets, side by side, one larger, one unmistakably Whiskers's. The staff began to whisper. Perhaps the wild bond, forged in fire and storm, had endured after all. Sawyer found comfort in those small, silent proofs. He still visited the old overhang where the story began, sometimes leaving food, sometimes just sitting in the hush. One evening, as dusk fell and the first stars blinked on, he spotted them, the silhouette of a wolf and a bobcat, moving together along the ridge, shapes weaving in and out of the trees. For a moment, the wild felt closer than ever, unreachable, yet part of him now. The town changed too. The night guard story became a touchstone, a reminder that even in a place marked by hardship and loss, kindness could spark change. Local policy shifted. New wildlife corridors were mapped. Predator management plans adjusted. Public education campaigns refocused on coexistence, not conflict. Volunteers doubled at the shelter. Kids brought in lost pets, wild birds, even injured squirrels, repeating the story of the wolf and the kitten, eyes shining with belief. Sawyer began speaking at schools, sharing what he'd learned, not just about wolves or bobcats, but about the hard, necessary work of mercy. Sometimes, he'd say, the bravest thing you can do is stand guard for someone else, even if it costs you, especially if it costs you. He saw the ripples of that lesson in the community, in the faces of people who came to the shelter with open minds, who left with open hearts. He saw it in the way Becca laughed more easily, in the way the ranchers paused before reaching for a rifle, in the way the children's drawings hung in every classroom window. In the final pages of his journal, Sawyer wrote, "Maybe we all need someone to stand guard through our storms. Maybe mercy, wild or human, is how we find our way home." One evening, as autumn gold deepened to dusk, he returned to the overhang one last time. The forest was quiet, peace humming in every pine. Somewhere in the shadows, a howl rose, soft, strong, and wild. Sawyer smiled, feeling not alone, but held by the bonds he'd helped to create. In the end, the greatest survival was not just to endure, but to connect, to let go, to trust, to remember, and to love. And as the night deepened, A wild shape moved through the trees, never tame, but never truly alone.